As we start our exploration of feudalism in Japan, we should take a look at how the feudal social structure looked in Japan as well. Alright, let's start off with a definition of what we'll call centralized feudalism. That's basically a social, political, and economic system that was based on personal loyalties, class distinctions, and the granting of land rights. You will note that this definition is not too different than the definition for feudalism that we used when we used the definition for feudal Europe. So again, in Japan and Europe, they're both doing feudalism. So let's start off with our traditional social structure chart. At the top, we've got an emperor in Japan. Basically, the emperor is simply a figurehead. He held no real political power. So this is very different than what we saw in Europe, whereas a king or an emperor like Charlemagne actually held real power. In Japan, the emperor does not. In fact, the emperors were considered to be gods, but over time they had lost their real political authority. However, people couldn't just discard them because they were, after all, descendants of gods, a god themselves, and so people couldn't just get rid of them. So the emperors were still a figurehead, but they didn't really have any political power or authority over anything that happened in Japan. So who does? Well, that's the next guy on the list. That's known as the shogun. Now, the shogun is a military governor general. He basically assumed the political power of the emperor, and he ruled with the support of a noble class of landowners. So the shogun, for us, is a lot like a king or an emperor. He's the guy who controls all the land. He's a general in this case. In this case, the shogun is the general that's beaten out all the other generals and taken power. But the reason why the shogun remains a military governor general and not an emperor or king is that he cannot replace the emperor of Japan, because the emperor of Japan is divine. He's a god. He's descended from the gods. The shogun is not. And so for the shogun to try to get rid of the emperor and make himself emperor, it wouldn't go over well in a country where everybody believes that the emperor of Japan is actually a god. Keep in mind, this was not something that was taken lightly. People in Japan considered the emperor a god even through World War II. It wasn't until after Japan's defeat in World War II that America forced the Japanese to stop considering their emperor a god. Next on the list is what's called the daimyo. The daimyo are the great landholders. These guys swore allegiance to the shogun, yet they were also very powerful themselves. They're an awful lot like in Europe, the nobles. The nobles were also landholders as well. They were given the land by the emperor, but in this case, the shogun grants the daimyo the land. If the daimyo are loyal to the shogun, he lets them keep the land. If they're not loyal, the shogun takes it away and gives it to somebody else who is. So this concept of land for loyalty also works with Japan as well as Europe. The next group are the samurai. These are the warriors who swore allegiance to a daimyo or to the shogun, and in return for that loyalty, they were given land grants as well. So the samurai are the equivalent of knights in Europe, right? They're the guys that go do most of the fighting. So if we look at this chart, emperor's a figurehead, but the shogun, daimyo, and the samurai, they're all very similar to what we see in a European system, where the emperor is at the top, followed by the nobles, the church officials, and the knights. So the top part of the Japanese chart looks an awful lot like the European chart. Again, about maybe 10% of the population is making up this group of people. So what's everybody else? Well, a majority of people are peasants. And again, the peasants in this case worked the farms. They also made the weapons, so they were the skilled craftsmen as well. Now, in return for doing that, the samurai would give them protection. So the argument was if the peasants worked hard and did their work and provided their services, then they would be protected by the samurais from maybe other bad samurai or pirates or other kinds of bad people. So that's the price that the peasants had to pay. But what we see on the Japanese chart that we didn't see in early Europe was merchants. Merchants are also on the chart. The problem is that merchants are at the bottom of the chart. They had very low social status, even though they may have held wealth. Now, what this tells me is that, to some degree, Confucianism had an influence on Japanese society, because we know in China that Confucius said that merchants were not good because they basically profited at the expense of other people's labor, and so he had them placed at the bottom of the chart. We see the same thing going on in Japan as well, that merchants are very low in status, they're at the bottom of society, they're really looked down upon. Their individual wealth was not relevant. Their low status was simply that they were not samurai and they didn't work hard like peasants to produce food, so they weren't seen as useful. Now, this will change. Just like in Europe, eventually in the Renaissance in Europe, merchants will show up at the chart and then all of a sudden make their way to the top of the chart. The same thing will happen in Japan. At the end of the Tokugawa period, which is the period of Japanese rule by the shogun, basically merchants will show up, very powerful at wealth. They'll have contact with foreigners for the first time, and their status will very quickly rise from the bottom of the chart to the top of the chart. But that will not come until the end of Japan's feudal period.